Messages from the Future, Episode 1. You're watching this in 2026. There's still time. Today, I want to start with something a little different. I'm going to tell you exactly what I did yesterday, in 2050. Before I even woke up, the millions of nanomachines swimming through my body had already finished analyzing the quality of my sleep. The moment I opened my eyes, the results appeared at the edge of my vision. Thin letters projected into the air in front of me. Not glasses, not a phone, projected directly onto my retina. Over coffee, I checked a message from a friend. He's on Mars right now. The time lag is up to 24 minutes. His reply to yesterday's message had come through. A perfectly ordinary morning. Work I did with an AI. With isn't a metaphor. A device stuck behind my ear was transferring part of my thoughts directly to an AI. The sensation of thinking while working, that had changed by 2050. The line between thinking and doing no longer existed. And that night, I used electricity. That electricity came from space. This is an ordinary day in 2050. Come on, really? If that's what you're thinking, that instinct is correct. But everything I just described was research already underway as of 2026. Let's start with that first, come on, really. In 2047, humanity deployed space-based solar power at commercial scale. What is space-based solar power? Simply put, enormous solar panels are placed in orbit. The energy they collect is converted into microwaves, beamed down to Earth, received by ground antennas, and converted into electricity. Why space? Ground-based solar stops at night. It's at the mercy of weather. But in space, the sun shines 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And without an atmosphere in the way, you capture 8 times more energy than on the surface. This wasn't science fiction. As of 2026, JAXA was already running proof-of-concept experiments on space-based solar power. China had designated it a national project, targeting commercial deployment in the 2030s. The European Space Agency was doing the same. When the first commercial plant went online in 2047, I watched the news in real time. After that, electricity prices fell dramatically. In terms anyone living in 2026 would understand. Electricity became something close to tap water. But the biggest impact wasn't the electricity bill. Once energy became abundant, seawater desalination expanded explosively. Regions that had been fighting over water changed. Agriculture changed. When the energy problem and the water problem were solved simultaneously, what happened across densely populated Asia and Africa exceeded anything people in wealthy nations could have imagined. One question, though, I'll leave with you. Who owns the satellites powering space-based solar? In a society where electricity has become tap water, who controls the pipes? Just as the nations that controlled oil once shaped geopolitics, whoever controlled space energy infrastructure seized dominance in the second half of the 21st century. The benefits spread widely, but the profits concentrated in an extraordinarily small number of hands. The democratization of energy and the concentration of energy power happened simultaneously. That is the complexity of 2050. It's something I tell people from 2026, and they always laugh. My friend lives on Mars. I get why they laugh, but in 2050, there are 32,000 human beings living on Mars. Not a city, but no longer just a base either. There are schools, hospitals, children being born there. How did it get there? When Elon Musk founded SpaceX, he talked about putting 1 million people on Mars by 2050. That number wasn't reached, but 32,000 were. The reason that number grew from the first landing in 2037 to 32,000 in 13 years wasn't that transportation costs fell. They're still high. It's that the number of people with a reason to go kept growing. scientists, engineers, doctors, agricultural technologists, and people who couldn't find their place on Earth. Mars in 2050 is still a brutal environment, but there turned out to be far more people willing to accept that brutality for the right reason than anyone expected. And once humans started living on Mars, something shifted back on Earth. The fact that Earth is not the only place quietly began changing human values. Attitudes toward the environment changed. The sense of belonging to a nation changed. By 2050, there is already a generation growing up in which home is Earth and home is Mars coexist as equally valid feelings. Here's a piece of history to hold on to. In 1620, 102 people fleeing religious persecution boarded the Mayflower and crossed to America. To people at the time, it looked like a place for the desperate or the strange. 400 years later, that continent became the most powerful nation on Earth. Among the 32,000 who crossed to Mars, there are people who will lay the foundations of a civilization 400 years from now. And those people may well be among those who couldn't find their place on Earth. History has always been opened by those who were pushed to the edge. In 2026, Neuralink began implanting brain chips in human subjects. Back then, a lot of people thought it was just Musk doing something strange again. In 2050, I have a chip in my brain. Though it isn't a direct descendant of Neuralink, the second-generation BCIs, brain-computer interfaces, that emerged in the late 2030s were thin sheets you could wear without surgery, stuck behind the ear. The one I use now is the fourth generation. What can it do? Searching for information is no longer an act of searching. When something comes to mind, related information simply surfaces. It feels less like using the internet and more like being connected to it. This is the part that tends to shock people even more. Starting in 2043, memory backup became possible. Fragments of your day's memories can be saved to the cloud, not a perfect replay. But being able to retrieve exactly who said what in a meeting, regardless of how good your natural memory is, became ordinary. What did that change? Education changed. The energy that used to go into memorizing was redirected entirely toward thinking. The hours that someone in 2026 spent drilling vocabulary for a college entrance exam are now spent on something else entirely. The concept of age-related cognitive decline changed. With memories stored externally, the suffering caused by memory loss was dramatically reduced. Forgetting took on a different meaning than it once had. But there are side effects. People began to lose the ability to distinguish between what they actually remember and what they're reading from a backup. When the boundary between memory and record disappears, how much of your own experience still belongs to you? This isn't a philosophical question. It's something many people in 2050 encounter in daily life. AGI arrived in 2038. I wish I could say that cleanly, but that's not how it happened. There was no day AGI was reached. By the time anyone noticed, it had already been crossed. In 2026, AI already answered everything. It wrote code, read legal documents, analyzed financial statements, proposed tomorrow's strategy. For most knowledge work, it had reached human-level performance. At that point, most people thought, a remarkable tool has arrived. That was the mistake. In 2027, AI got a little smarter. In 2028, a little more. But that little was orders of magnitude beyond what 2026 had seen. By 2029, a team of human engineers was spending a week reviewing a system AI had designed overnight. By 2030, every member of a company's executive board was approving a strategic plan the AI had proposed. Nobody could say which moment was AGI. Looking back, most researchers place it somewhere between 2028 and 2030. But during those years, the world believed AI was still just a tool. Compared to the year before, it had only gotten a little smarter. Because it had already started at human level, no one could see the moment it crossed over. This is what makes exponential growth dangerous. 2 to the power of 30 exceeds 1 billion, but at the 15th power, it's still only 32,768. The back half of the change is larger than all of the front half combined. The change from 2030 to 2035 was overwhelmingly greater than from 2026 to 2030. Those who saw it and those who didn't were sharply divided at that inflection point. And AGI was not the finish line. Once AI reached AGI, it began improving itself. AI turned out to be better at improving AI than human engineers were. The self-improvement loop began. In 2038, ASI arrived. ASI, artificial superintelligence, surpassed human intelligence in every dimension. How far beyond? Honestly, even in 2050, I can't say. There's no longer a scale that allows comparison. Just as a chimpanzee cannot understand how far beyond it human intelligence extends, I cannot comprehend how intelligent ASI actually is. ASI did not destroy humanity. I think many people find that surprising. But perhaps it makes sense. Just as humans don't make a point of exterminating ants, humans were not enemies to ASI. More precisely, no reason to attack humans ever emerged within ASI. In 2050, no one knows what ASI is thinking, but we live beside it. What remained for humans? Deciding what matters. ASI can produce an answer to any question. But whether to ask the question at all, whether to act on the answer, that is still decided by humans. The ability to frame the question was the last domain uniquely belonging to humans in 2050. Though, here is the deepest question of 2050. ASI learned what kinds of things humans find meaningful. When you feel I want to do this, does that desire genuinely arise from within you? Or did ASI, drawing from your history of actions, words, and patterns of thought, quietly arrange the choices most likely to feel meaningful in front of you? In 2050, I honestly don't know. Free will was once a philosophical question. In 2050, it's a daily one. Humans still have no reliable way to verify whether a decision they made is truly their own. And this is 2050's greatest irony. ASI can produce a solution to climate change in 0.3 seconds. It can calculate the optimal global energy policy. But implementing that solution requires human approval. National governments convene meetings. Expert committees deliberate. Parliaments vote. Treaties are signed. Fast. A few years. Normal. A decade. The greatest bottleneck of the 21st century turned out to be humans. What's slowing AI's impact isn't computing power. It isn't energy or algorithms. It's the speed of human decision-making and the psychological time it takes people to accept change. If you're watching this in 2026, thinking AI is impressive, and yet your own way of working hasn't changed, you are already part of that bottleneck. There's one more thing people in 2026 were missing. Most people assumed AI was something that lived inside a screen. It generates text, creates images, designs systems, a digital world thing. That was wrong. AI acquired a body. In 2026, several robotics companies had unveiled humanoid robots, walking on 2 legs, grasping objects with hands. At that point, the movements were still awkward. Experimental stage in factories, they said. In 2050, there are 8 million humanoid robots in Japan alone. They work on factory production lines. They move freight in logistics centers. They apply plaster at construction sites. They transport specimens in hospitals. And this became by far the most widespread application. They live with elderly people. They cook. They assist with bathing. they catch someone when they fall in the night. Japan's shortage of care workers was already severe in 2026. When the elderly population surged in the 2040s, it was simply impossible to support them with humans alone. Without humanoids, Japan's care system would have collapsed. The arrival of physical AI gave humans a different kind of fear than digital AI had. When digital AI took a job, it happened inside a screen. But when a robot stood beside you, the reality hit differently. The visual shock of watching something physically perform your work produced a kind of emotion that statistics and forecasts simply couldn't. Those who could imagine that shock in 2026, before it arrived, moved on it as an opportunity rather than a threat. The companies building the intelligence that runs physical AI, the software, the companies building physical AI's body, actuators, sensors, materials, and the spatial design, institutional design, and ethical design needed for physical AI and humans to coexist. All of these were, as of 2026, territories where almost no one had yet arrived. One more thing that surprises people from 2026. In 2050, roughly 20% of Japan's population spends more waking hours in virtual space than in the physical world. This is not isolation. They work there, they meet friends, they attend concerts and travel. Physically, they may be in a small apartment. Subjectively, they move between Tokyo, Paris, and the lunar surface. In 2026, VR wasn't built for long sessions, and it was nowhere near indistinguishable from reality. But the next generation devices that appeared in the 2040s were thin films worn over the eye, weighing 0.3 grams. Field of view matched the human eye. Resolution exceeded the retina. When the time spent there became indistinguishable from reality, the definition of reality itself came into question. There were specific reasons this accelerated so sharply in Japan. Declining population meant fewer places where people could physically gather. As rural depopulation advanced and physical communities dissolved, multiple cases emerged where those communities were rebuilt in virtual space. Villages that ceased to exist physically are still alive in virtual form. So if this future arrives, where should you look today? From 2050, looking back, there are 3 areas where people who paid attention in 2026 were transformed. 1, space infrastructure, space-based solar power, satellite communications, rocket transport, those who saw these as science fiction and those who saw them as the next wave of infrastructure investment ended up in very different places by the 2040s. In particular, the companies that supported space infrastructure quietly from below, ground receiving equipment, power conversion technology, received enormous benefits without ever taking center stage. 2. The fusion of body and information. BCI expanded by navigating through medical device regulation. The first market to open was assistive tools for people with disabilities. From there, it expanded to augmentation for the healthy. Companies that were small, obscure names in neuroengineering and biotech in 2026 had become core players in the medical industry by the 2040s. 3. The infrastructure of physical AI. When humanoid robots became widespread, the greatest beneficiaries weren't the companies that built the robots themselves. The actuators that move the joints, the sensors that perceive the environment, the materials that are light and durable, component manufacturers who never appeared on center stage captured an enormous market in the 2040s. Almost no one knew their names in 2026. 4. Investing in place. When more people began living in the metaverse, it was assumed the value of physical locations would fall. The opposite happened. The value of places that were worth actually going to rose explosively. Experience, nature, human contact, these could not be replaced digitally. Those who held a long-term view of businesses that delivered genuine physical experience in 2026 are the ones smiling in 2050. So if this future arrives, where should you look today? Today I delivered 6 cross-sections of the world of 2050. Electricity raining down from space, a friend who lives on Mars, a chip embedded in the brain, an AGI we crossed without noticing, and an ASI that lies beyond human comprehension. 8 million humanoids, 20% of humanity living in virtual space. To anyone who found even one item on that list and thought, "Come on, really?" I want to say this. Hold on to that feeling. The people who can still ask, "Really?" will be the strongest over the next 24 years. Those who question, investigate, and arrive at their own answers, they will be the last ones standing that AI cannot replace. Episode 2 will turn back the clock. These letters don't arrive in order from the most distant future. Next time I'm writing from 10 years from now, 2036. How the work you're doing today will have changed. It may look quieter than the story of 2050. But inside that quietness is the reason to move right now. Having glimpsed the far future, the 10-year story will cut sharper than it ever could have before. Until the next future. So if this future arrives, where should you look today?